It's absolutely right that people should be able to express themselves. The danger is the thing lurches from one extreme to another. And the extremes at this point are not a good place to be, because if somebody is chanting pro-Palestinian slogans and implying that the Palestinians should possess the whole land, as the famous quote is, from the river to the sea, what then are you saying about the Jewish people who have come there over the last 2 generations? Likewise, if the settlers are saying, we own the whole land now, or we're just going to get rid of the Palestinians, same problem, guys. And this is not the way to peace there, and it's not the way to peace for the rest of the world. The danger with protests is that they become shrill and shallow. And of course, it's now bundled up in America, particularly with left-right politics.
Paul apparently, fairly clearly, seems to say, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, and saying God has appointed these authorities to rule over you and so on. So what is the point at which a Christian, or anyone, I suppose, should actually choose to rail against and rise up, possibly, put themselves in the firing line, go to prison for it?
Welcome, you are joining us for another episode of the Re-Enchanting podcast, which is the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen, where I, along with my co-host Justin Brierley, and a wonderful range of guests, we ponder re-enchantment, whether we're craving it and whether it can be found in the wonder and the mystery of the Christian story.
Belle and I are really looking forward to engaging with N.T. Wright today, Senior Research Fellow at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University. Tom, of course, has written extensively on Jesus, Paul, early Christianity, and his work has been hugely influential. As well as his notable academic career, Tom, of course, has served in various roles in the Church of England, including Bishop of Durham from 2003 to 2010. But today we're talking to Tom about his latest book, co-authored with Mike Bird, Jesus and the Powers, Christian Political Witness in an Age of Totalitarian Terror and Dysfunctional Democracies. How about that for a title? We'll be asking today, how can we re-enchant 21st century politics with a first century vision of Jesus as Lord?
Indeed. Now, for anyone watching, you can see where Tom is, and it's everything you want N.T. Wright study to look like. For those who are listening, just picture what you want him to be sat in front of, and he is sat in front of that. So I feel like our first question, Tom, might have been made for you because it is book related. And it is, what are you reading at the moment?
At the moment, I'm rereading for, I think, the 5th, 6th, 7th time, C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles. And I am enjoying it as I always do, but I'm much more critical of it now than I used to be, especially when I first read it, which was, 55 years ago, maybe, when I was an undergraduate. That's been fascinating, actually, because I'm a great Lewis lover, and of course he writes amazingly, but I am now getting quite a bit of critical distance on the fact that he was still basically a Platonist throughout most of his life, and I think that jangles with his very fine chapter on the resurrection. I think he gets the resurrection pretty much exactly right, but how that sits with his Platonic vision, I'm not sure he ever worked that out. In a sense, he didn't need to. It wasn't his thing to do that, but his split of nature and supernature, which is how the book is positioned, I think has been enormously unhelpful, not least to the current task of apologetics in North America particularly.
May I ask, Tom, did you ever meet the man in the flesh, or did your paths never quite manage to overlap?
I mean, Lewis died the same day as Jack Kennedy, so November 1963, I was still a schoolboy. When I came up to Oxford 5 years later, it was one of my sorrows that Lewis wasn't around because he died quite young. Of course, he died in his 60s. And nor did I meet Tolkien, though I very nearly did. I became a fellow of Merton College just a few months after Tolkien had died, and I gathered that Tolkien used to come in for lunch most days, so I would have met him had I been a year earlier in that position.
Oh, well, I for one, would have loved to have been in a conversation involving you critiquing Lewis's Platonic views in Miracles.
Oh, he would have run rings round me.
Anyway, it's lovely to see you, yes, in your personal study. We do normally record this show, of course, at the top of Lambeth Palace Library, hence our book-inspired question at the start of every show. But we're here to talk about your latest book, Jesus and the Powers. Just start maybe by giving us, there we go, holding it up for the camera. Very good, very good, very good. Just give us a sense of what the political climate might have been like in Jesus's day, when he began his ministry.
Yeah, of course, our word politics, like our word religion, both does and doesn't map onto first century reality. We have separated out different bits of life. As far as first century people were concerned, it was all a rich mixture, and politics and religion were, pretty much an unbreakable duo. Because for the devout Judean, certainly somebody in Jesus' world or the Pharisees' world or the Sadducees' world, the question of believing in Israel's God and the question of what you believed about the promised future of your own country and your own kin were absolutely all bound up together. And likewise, the Greek political culture, which had swept through the Middle East 3 centuries earlier, had inculcated all sorts of ideas which, again, weren't separable as political ideas from the what we would call the religious beliefs that went with them, the different gods and lords and so on. But particularly, of course, ever since the Romans had marched into the Middle East about a century before Jesus' day and had taken over and were imposing their own governors and taxes and goodness knows what, then, well, Caesar worship was the fastest growing religion in Jesus and Paul's day. Rome was obviously the most important god on the block right then, because Rome was so powerful. This must be divine. And Caesar at the head of Rome, well, he's obviously the one who, and Augustus styled himself the son of the deified Julius, Tiberius styled himself the son of the deified Augustus, etc. So the Son of God, who was also the high priest, because priesthood and political things went together, that was the world into which Jesus was born. So that when he asked, show me a tribute penny, I've actually got one somewhere around the study. I won't try and find it now, but it's got a picture of Tiberius on it. And on one side it says in Latin, Son of God, and on the other side it says High Priest. And then you see, okay, that's how politics and religion kind of worked. And it's a rich mixture. And so the question then of what does it mean to say it's time for God to become king? Yeah, there were people in Jesus' day who wanted that. We want God to be king. We don't want Herod. We don't want Caesar. We maybe don't even want a Messiah. We just want God. We want a total and utter theocracy. And when Jesus said it is time for God to become king, but it's not going to look like you thought it was, that's not just a religious statement in our terms. That's emphatically about society, politics, about what's going on in the world as a whole.
I think one of your most famous quotes, or I hear it in so many sermons, is when you say that to declare that Jesus is Lord is to imply that Caesar was not. And that's what Christians, the early church, were doing in their words, but also in their deeds and in their, the way they were living life. And that saturates the writings of Paul and John and all, sort of this persecution, the fact that they were, in a way that I'm definitely oversimplifying, enemies of empire, in so many ways, suffering under empire and growing amidst that suffering. But then being a biblical studies person, that's where I sort of stop. And my history of Christianity and the way it engaged with empire stops with them suffering under it. But there was this fascinating pivot, because obviously they became neck and neck with them. They became embedded in empire. Could you just tell us a little bit about, this is huge and I'm aware, I'm asking you to do something massive, but just this pivot between being oppressed by the empire and then being lifted up by it, and then some of the good and the bad that sort of came from that.
When we use the word empire in the abstract, as a lot of people do these days, that's a new thing, by the way. During my lifetime, people didn't used to talk like that, but I think it's quite appropriate, because as every Jew knew who had read, say, the book of Daniel, you get the different great empires, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Syria, Egypt, now Rome, and it's kind of taken for granted that this is how the world works, that power seems to pass to one large country that then inflicts their will on everybody else. And people who are in small countries that get in the way of all this stuff just have to put up with it. And, oh, they're the bosses now, so, okay, we'll pay them taxes for the sake of a quiet life, although we've got some friends down the road who are planning insurrection, whatever. All that's going on. And so the question of what you think about empire then has to coexist, even at the time, and we see this in Jesus and Paul, with the sense which is really deeply rooted all the way back to Genesis 1 or Psalm 8, that the God who made the world wants his world to be properly run. God does not like anarchy. God wants wise human beings to rule his world. The whole image of Solomon as the wise king and the world being at peace under Solomon until it all starts to go horribly wrong again. That's the image which then comes through in several later biblical books and in some post-biblical Jewish books, the idea of God's chosen wise person through whom God's wisdom is working out in the world. So that the parade example is in John chapter 19, when Pilate says to Jesus, don't you realize that I have authority to have you killed? And Jesus says, you could have no authority over me unless it was given you from above. And sort of, hang on, even Jesus says to even Pontius Pilate, you have a God-given authority over me. And this is an amazing statement of creational monotheism. God wants his world to be run. But the corollary is, so the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. In other words, God does want his world to be run by human beings, but God will hold them to account. And Jesus and his followers have the task of bringing that holding to account right into the present. Now, we have done it totally differently in our day. Ever since the 18th century, this is coming a long way forward, and then I'll come back to the substance of your question in just a second. Ever since the 18th century, the Western democracies have assumed that God is now out of the picture. We banished God upstairs. That's a private religious matter between you and God. Get on with it. But we're going to run the world our way. And we think that by giving the people a choice as to who they want to run them in what we call democracy or voting and all that, this will bring about the best of all possible results. And we these days have this sort of phrase, well, how's that going then over the last 3 centuries? Whether we have the guillotine or the gulag or whatever it may be, or as now the subtitle of this book says, Totalitarian, Terror and Dysfunctional Democracies. By the way, all the alliterative stuff comes from my co-author, Mike Bird, who, being an Australian, loves these flowery phrases. I tried to hold him back, but it was quite a good resonant thing. So we live in a different world. Now, that transition, you see, people often say, well, the church basically sold out because the emperor decided to become a Christian, or say he was, and the church thought, oh, good, we get to sit at the table with the emperor. And no doubt there is compromise and there are problems there. But what I always say to people is, supposing you've been being persecuted for the last 200 years, and then the emperor comes to you and says, actually, despite what we've been doing, there are so many of you that we're going to turn things around. Are you going to say to the emperor, no, please go on persecuting us because we'll feel so much more authentic if you do that. So please don't you become a Christian. And I just think this is counterintuitive. Of course they're not going to say that. Of course they're going to say, praise God from whom all blessings flow. Now things can move forward. But, you know, I was struck recently lecturing on Acts, and I've just written an article about this as well, by something that happens which is a straw in the wind pointing forward to that, which is in Acts chapter 18, when Paul is hauled before Gallio, the proconsul, and the Jewish community want to accuse Paul of teaching people to worship in ways that they're not supposed to, which I think means that he is doing Jewish worship, but it's got Jesus in the middle of it now. Now, the thing is, Jews are allowed by Rome to worship their God. And Gallio says Christianity is basically a subset of Judaism. Carry on, nothing to see here. Oh my goodness, this means that in southern Greece, from the mid-50s, Christianity is legal. Now, what happens? Well, read 1 Corinthians and then 2 Corinthians. Those are the only 2 Pauline letters which don't mention persecution, because it's not happening in Corinth. And so, guess what? They have personality cults. They go soft on sexual morality. They don't know what to think about the resurrection. They're careless about the plight of the poor. They're having lawsuits with one another. They're mucking around in liturgical worship and the Eucharist and so on. Well, of course they are, because it's suddenly become okay and it's free for all and anyone can come in and we're having a party here and why did you join? And Paul has to say, no, sorry, this is what belonging to Jesus looks like. And they don't want to know. They think, oh, Paul, you're a jailbird. You get beaten up all over the place. We're obviously the kings and the high and mighty around here. In other words, already the danger of collusion with empire is right there in the New Testament itself. And if we think we then see it in the 4th and 5th centuries, well, don't be surprised. How are you going to navigate that? And actually, under Constantine and his successors, the church was not stupid about this. There were no doubt some who were, but there were emperors who were held to account by bishops, for instance, for their enforcing of the death penalty. There was one emperor who was excommunicated for his enforcing of the death penalty. So, it wasn't all good being persecuted before and bad under the empire subsequently. We've got to have a much more nuanced view of what's going on. I'm sorry, you just got a whole lecture, but that was such a great...
No, it's a great... I think for me, to bring it to sort of contemporary times, it raises that whole question of, well, people often bemoan, or some Christians bemoan, the waning influence of the church in the West and in the UK and so on, and think, if only we could, have the influence we once had. But obviously, there is always a mixed bag, isn't it, when you become allied to power and influence and so on. So, I mean, do you? What's your take on that, Tom? Do you think actually we're better off as a church that's more on the margins, that isn't, as it were, in the seat of power and so on?
I was going to say it's too soon to say. There are so many different things going on. One of the things that struck me, whenever it was 15 years ago at the Lambeth conference, talking to church leaders from South Sudan, from Myanmar, from different parts of Latin America, the different situations politically and socially are so diverse that there's no one size fits all. And the difference between being a British Anglican in Britain and being an Anglican in Canada, say, or Australia, is quite marked. And so it's very difficult to say yes to this and no to that. I want to say in each situation, there's a call for discernment. What are we to say to the powers and authorities now? And I take the bottom line here, as in Jesus' response to Pilate, as in John 16, when the Spirit comes, the Spirit will convict the world of sin and righteousness and judgment and so on, that it's a basic 101 level Christian commitment to speak truth to power. We have backed right off from that in the last 3 centuries. We've said, no, our truth is a spiritual truth, so we'll say it to one another in church and when we say our prayers, but then the politicians must sort out their stuff how they want. No, actually, democracy is fine, and we argue for liberal democracy in this book as being the least worst of the possible options, but the church has an inalienable vocation to hold a mirror to power, to speak the truth to power. And it's not enough to say, oh, we voted 5 years ago, so you've had a mandate ever since then to do what you like. No, voting is a steer, but then every individual policy, the church ought to be able to have people who have studied that stuff, who are experts in it and not just shooting from the hip, who will say, actually, that's not a good way to go, and that critique doesn't quite work, and this policy would be better, and here's why. Have we been doing that as a church? Barely. There are some now who are, but that's not been a major feature.
But you talk about that moment before Pilate, and of course, the line that is often used by some Christians who do think we should dissociate ourselves from politics is, my kingdom is not of this world. So what do you think is actually the intention of that particular passage? And I imagine you have your own superior translation of it. I can see you reaching for your New Testament in Greek there already, Tom.
I confess I forget how I translated it in my own translation, which I also do have right here. But it's when they say when Pilate asks Jesus if he's a king, and Jesus basically says yes but and no but, and then he says my kingdom isn't. And the Greek is he basileia hemu ukestin ek tu kosmoutusu. My kingdom is not from this world. The translation of the world has been the cause of people projecting their Platonism onto the text and saying, oh, Jesus' kingdom is purely spiritual, purely heavenly, etc. John 18:36, where I've translated, my kingdom isn't the sort that grows in this world. It's not out of this world. And the difference is, if it were out of this world, my servants would be fighting. That's what kingdoms in this world do. But Jesus is doing this extraordinary thing of saying, my kingdom is here and it's for this world, but because it's from God's sphere into our sphere, we're doing it differently. Just like the end of Mark 10, the kings of the world bully and boss people about, we're going to do it the other way about. The one who wants to be great must be your servant. So the key thing is the little Greek word ek, which means out of, and it doesn't mean from in the sense that people have usually taken it.
So there's a really, really helpful little section of the book which talks about different kind of political strands. So, for example, it says that communism is both too Christian and not Christian enough. It's very Christian in that it wants all of the ideals that look and sound so much like Jesus. Some of the language feels like it has, hasn't it? It's been taken straight from Jesus. There's that. I had dinner with people last night who did the whole Labour owes more to Methodists than Marx. And there's all of this. But then also it's not Christian enough in that it doesn't take into account we can't make that happen ourselves, though, can we? So is that the essence of what Jesus is saying there, and that's what we've missed?
Yeah, I mean, the church has always been called from the beginning to be what I've been, the phrase that they're now teasing me about in Wycliffe because I've used it so much, to be the small working model of new creation. And you can see that in Acts 2 and in Acts 4, and then going on, that the church is to have this vision of what God's new world looks like, and we are to model that in the present as best we can. And that will be out of sorts with the world around us, but people will look and say, oh, didn't know you could live that way. Oh my goodness, that's different. How does that work? And well, we're following this person called Jesus, and this is how he taught us to live. And so there is always that challenge. But obviously in the early church, there's no chance of the early Christians saying, right, so we're now going to reorganize Corinth or Thessalonica or somewhere, and so that it works according to Jesus' rules. So we don't have early Christian evidence of people trying to do that. But when we think of Marxism and so on, and yes, there used to be quite an alliance of the old Labour Party with Methodism. I remember when I was a boy, the Methodist Party conference each year would include a weekend, and the Labour Party conference would include a weekend where they would go to the local Methodist church, and the leader of the Labour Party and his deputy would read the lessons in church on the Sunday. That would be broadcast. And that was just part of who they were. But the thing is this, in the 19th century, Marxism is basically a Christian heresy, or perhaps one should say a Jewish heresy. It's a way of dreaming the dream of this great new world, which is there in the Old Testament. But the question then is, how do you get there? And of course, it's a way of dreaming that dream of the new world, but the price you've got to pay is the suffering of the people who we want to get rid of and people who are in the way, rather than the suffering of Israel's Messiah, of Jesus, and then allowing the new creation to flow out from there. And so we can see the different bits of 19th century philosophy, including Marxism, are trying to retain bits of Christianity, but they can't do it because they haven't got Jesus right at the center of it. The question then of different churches that have embraced different bits of this vision, yes, we need to do that, and we need to learn from one another. As part of the problem always was that the Church of England was seen as a bit too high and dry, and the Methodists came through and say, no, we want to preach in the fields to the workers and to the miners and people like that. And the Church of England had forgotten them. It's time to get past that and say, let's all do it all together. And then all sorts of things could happen out of that.
Yeah. I mean, given what you write in the book about this idea that those words from Jesus, mistranslated often, not of this world, in fact, it's about my kingdom is not coming from this world, but it's obviously still for this world. It's still something that Christ is saying we are meant to be involved, and that includes being involved in politics. I mean, at a very practical level, what might that look like, I don't know, on a Sunday morning from the pulpit? I mean, are you the kind of person who does put a little bit of contemporary politics into your sermons, Tom? Are you happy when you hear a preacher perhaps giving their opinions on, policies around immigration, marriage, or whatever it may be?
Sure, because there are very definite things in the New Testament about caring for the stranger, etc. I once, a midnight communion on Christmas Eve in Durham Cathedral, I once included in my sermon something about asylum seekers and linking it up with Jesus, Mary and Joseph having to flee into Egypt and live there until it was safe to come back again. And on the way out, somebody came up to me and said, "Was that you preaching the sermon?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, you should leave asylum seekers out of it, though. Stick to the main theme." And he then disappeared out of the door before I could say, what about Matthew chapter 2? This, okay, it may be a political issue, and it may be that people are right to be concerned about border controls and so on. We live in a small country. There isn't room for thousands and thousands more people all the time. Our NHS is swamped, whatever, Most countries have some kind of rules about how you regulate immigration. It's an interesting question as to why so many people do want to come. They're not content to stay in France or Germany or the Low Countries. They want to come to the UK. And that's an interesting political question as to why that should be. But certainly, of course, that's a major topic which should be preached about. Look at the Psalms, look at the prophets about the care for the stranger and the widow and the orphan and so on. It's all there. Then the question is, how do you actually do it? The church in its early days was living as an extended family. So that the first controversy in the church was that some of the widows who were being looked after felt they were being neglected by people who spoke a different language. And so as soon as you say we're going to do things differently, you're going to have some practical questions. How does that actually work out? So they chose 7 people to make sure that was running well. And so the church needs to be on the ball in terms of where are the key issues, how are we going to help deal with them, so that for me, I must have said dozens of times that quote that you said, Belle, about Jesus is Lord, so Caesar isn't. I must have said that dozens of times from the pulpit and tried to explain some of what that might look like, that whoever we elect as Prime Minister or President of the United States or whatever, we have to, as church, explain constantly what it means to say that Jesus is Lord. It doesn't mean we don't have a president or a prime minister. It means that we hold them to account before the God we see revealed in Jesus. And we have to go on doing that. And simply saying, oh, well, we voted for him, so it must be okay, just isn't good enough. The early Jews and Christians of that time, they didn't much care how people became rulers. There were all sorts of, by assassination or sheer accident or whatever. They cared very much about what people did once they got power. And we have to recover that, which is risky because we'll get it wrong. We need to do our research. That's why I say we need people, experts in different fields, to advise church spokesmen so that we aren't simply going off with knee-jerk reactions according to which newspaper we happen to read that morning. And I am very much aware of that as a danger for myself. I'm trying to do lots of things at once, and I can easily get a point of view from a newspaper article, and the danger is translating that straight into a sermon. So you have to hang on, no, let's test this out. Let's talk to key people who know, etc., etc. Let's be wise and let's be seen to be wise. Wouldn't that be nice?
If you enjoy listening to Re-Enchanting, then you'll probably enjoy our other 2 podcasts from Seen and Unseen. Seen and Unseen Aloud is a weekly dose of commentary on culture, trends and current affairs. God Pod is a deeper dive into theology and faith, hosted by Graham Tomlin, Jane Williams and Michael Lloyd. You can find them wherever you get your podcasts from. For now, back to today's episode of Re-Enchanting.
I am so fascinated at the moment, and at the time of recording, the protests against Gaza, Israel are happening across universities in America. It's the headline news.
And here, there's one a few hundred yards away from where I'm sitting right now.
And you have a chapter which is all about obedience, civil and uncivil, disobedience and obedience. And it's so topical, it's so urgent, that is such a question for right now. And I would just love to glean some of your thoughts on, if not just for Christians, but if you were explaining it to people who aren't Christians as well, when and who should Christians disobey?
It is, of course, a very difficult issue, but on that particular issue, and I did live in the Middle East for a while and just absorbed a lot of the tensions that were there, and that was 35 years ago during the first Intifada, and it's just got worse since then. But so I think I'm aware of the different sensitivities. And when I was there, I found I kept my ears open, and everybody I talked to had a subtly different story. And the stories weren't all compatible with one another, but they were all definitely what that person and their family really believed about the situation. And I just realized that this is far too complex for somebody marching in from England and saying, okay, you're wrong about this, you're right about that, now sort it out. It goes way, way back, a long way back. And I grew up knowing the story of, well, I remember the movie Exodus, which was about Jewish refugees from Europe who'd somehow escaped the Holocaust and having to get a boat and run the gauntlet of people, not least the British soldiers, who were trying to stop them getting into Palestine, and how all that worked. And all my sympathies, as I'm sure all my generation, were entirely with the Jewish refugees after the Holocaust, etc., etc. It was only when I lived in Jerusalem, and my next-door neighbor was a Palestinian archdeacon at St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. And he was a delightful guy, and he sat me down and explained a few things about what had happened to him in 1948, 1949, and his family, etc., etc. You realize, oh my goodness, there are many, many different sides to this story, and it behoves us, particularly us British, the Balfour Declaration and all that, to back off from hasty judgments. Having said all that, the imperative to peace must be a priority. And we must support all those who are trying by whatever means they can to make peace. And as I say, that involves several different layers of conflict resolution, as well as involving America and Iran, for instance, because Iran clearly is behind some of what's going on at the moment, at least if not quite a lot of it. But also it involves us as Christians in thinking through how distortions of Christianity have hindered the process of peace, particularly people who say, as many in America are doing, that the Holy Land always was the Jews' homeland and it should now be the Jews' homeland. And so we've got to support the settler movement, and just if that means ridding the country of Palestinians, so be it. And I want to say, no, this is a fundamental misreading of the Bible. The whole world is now God's holy land. That's the vision of Paul in Romans chapter 8. It's the vision of Jesus when he says, all authority in heaven and earth is given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. The whole world now belongs to God. Well, the promises about the land are not abandoned. They're extended to cover the whole creation. So anything which says, oh, this little strip of turf inalienably belongs here or there, no, we can't. And I think if people had realized this and preached it for many years, then things would have been very different by now. So having said all of that, what do we say to the protesters? I just cycled past them on our way back from Wycliffe this morning, an encampment outside the Pitt Rivers Museum in the middle of Oxford. And I think we say it's absolutely right that people should be able to express themselves. The danger is that the thing lurches from one extreme to another. And the extremes at this point are not a good place to be, because if somebody is chanting pro-Palestinian slogans and implying that the Palestinians should possess the whole land, as the famous quote is, from the river to the sea, what then are you saying about the Jewish people who have come there over the last 2 generations? Likewise, if the settlers are saying, we own the whole land now, or we're just going to get rid of the Palestinians, same problem, guys. And this is not the way to peace there, and it's not the way to peace for the rest of the world. The danger with protests is that they become shrill and shallow, and then the sloganeering is too easy, and people grasp onto this or that. And of course, it's now bundled up in America, particularly with left-right politics, as Joe Biden is finding to his cost, because, the question of if you're a right-wing American, you may well be a supporter of Israel, but then what about the left-wing Americans who might be expected to vote Democrat or for Biden? Because a lot of them don't want to see Israel wiped off the map either. So there are huge issues going on there. And again, it means that people have got to think wisely and speak clearly and do so in a layered fashion. There is this, there is also that, and this integrates with these things, etc., and not in this head-to-head bull meets bull confrontation. That's just going to make matters worse.
I think it's when those protests do boil over from being effectively peaceful protests to confrontations, conflagrations, uprisings and so on, that it becomes the really hard question, because there are going to be obviously protesters of all kinds, on all kinds of issues who say, well, it is my moral duty to be subversive in this way, to not sort of, and it comes down to, ultimately for me, it brings us to that famous passage in Romans 13, 1-7, where Paul apparently fairly clearly seems to say, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, and saying God has appointed these authorities to rule over you and so on. So what is the point at which a Christian, or anyone, I suppose, should actually choose to rail against and rise up, possibly, put themselves in the firing line, go to prison for it, and so on?
I mean, and that then slides all the way through to the Bonhoeffer question. What do you do in 1943, 4 and 5 if you genuinely believe that the person who is now running Germany is a monster and a dangerous maniac and totally mad, etc.? And all I can say is I'm hugely grateful to God that I have not been in that situation or anything remotely like it. And I don't know what I would do if I were. But Romans 13, 1-7, which is a very short passage. I mean, it's not as though this is a major exposition in the letter. It's simply good creational monotheism. As I said, it's a way of saying God wants his world to be wisely ordered. So you're a little Christian group in Rome. Don't start getting silly and imagining that you're going to do what some Judeans are doing in Judea right now in the 50s or 60s, which is getting ready to revolt against Rome. That's not the way. Your revolt against Rome is by being a community loyal to Lord Jesus, living right there under the nose of Lord Caesar. And that will be far more effective, actually, in the long run. So in the meantime, and you see this in the 2nd century, the apologists say, look, we are good citizens. We pay our taxes. We are kind. We are helpful. We obey the laws until and unless they require us to deny Jesus. You see it in the martyrdom of Polycarp in the middle of the 2nd century, where Polycarp says, sure, I will try and explain to you what the Christian faith is all about, because our scriptures teach us to respect those in authority. So, Mr. Procurator, I respect you, and let's have a dialogue together. But when the Procurator says, I want you to offer a pinch of incense to Caesar, absolutely not. Sorry, that's a red line. We don't do that. So you can see the 2nd century church wrestling with exactly the same question, and respecting the authorities because God wants his world to be wisely ruled, being sure you know where the red lines are, and being prepared to speak the truth to power and to say, when you do this, whether it's killing prisoners or whatever it is, this is not the way that the God who made the world wants his world to be run. And if you don't like me saying it, well, tough. Like John the Baptist holding Herod to account and lost
I suppose
his head.
It's instructive that the very person who wrote those words frequently found himself in prison, at the pleasure of the local governor or whatever. Yeah.
The book of Acts is almost funny like that, in that constantly Paul is getting in trouble, and then the authorities have to say, sorry, actually, we shouldn't have beaten you up, or we shouldn't have imprisoned you. And you think by the time we've run that script 4 or 5 or 6 times, you might just wonder, maybe part of the problem is Paul himself. But that is the message of Acts, that yes, you've got to act subversively, but in the end, trust that the God-given authorities will say, actually, there wasn't a charge against you, whatever, which might or might not be the case.
The interesting thing so I'm just thinking about all of these kind of instances where people, Christian and not Christian, have felt that it's their absolute duty and right to resist. So thinking of people currently now who are camping on their university lawns, but also thinking of people who didn't do the lockdowns or didn't have vaccines. And I suppose what's quite hard is we can look back at someone like Bonhoeffer, and we can look back at these things and we can think, that's really black and white with hindsight, and I know what side of history I would have been on. And that feels so much more murky in the present. And is that just a wisdom thing again, when it comes to this Christian speaking truth to power?
I think it is about wisdom. I mean, the whole vaccine thing is fascinating, and we feel those questions swirling around in our household actually from time to time. The two quite different issues. One, are these vaccines a wicked plot by some right-wing government or by Bill Gates or somebody to pump information or whatever into us? Or two, have these properly been tested, and are they medically dubious despite what the initial claims were? Those are quite different questions. And I know some people who would be anti-vax on the second one, but who would completely reject the first. So simply being pro-vax or anti-vax, again, it's not as simple as that. It's not as easy as that. It's interesting that in the book we call Ecclesiasticus, the wisdom of Jesus ben Sira, 200 BC, give or take, there's that little passage about respecting the medical profession. God has given them gifts, and we need them, and that's a good thing, etc. And so you can imagine already a situation where some people are saying, if God wants to heal me, God will heal me. Why should we need these doctors? They're probably a bit dodgy and out on the make themselves. So it's not a new question. So I think discernment, there's plenty in the New Testament about the gift of discernment, about discerning the spirits, and that when wise Christians say their prayers, study the evidence, and then think it through, then they may not agree, but that's the beginning point. Whereas, alas, we've become, as I've said before, a knee-jerk society. We look at an issue, we know what the right answer is. We heard somebody on the radio saying something, and that seemed to strike a chord with us. And often that's because an itch which we need to scratch in our own psyches, which this seems to be answering to, and we need to back off from that and learn wisdom, and our leaders and teachers need to convey that to us.
Yeah, I suppose what's interesting is that it's not resistance or disobedience or whatever for the sake of it, to belong to the resistors, because I want a sense of belonging and I want to belong to the protest, to the resistance, but that it's always for the good of those who are marginalised or the good of those who are suffering, and it never wanes either way from that, I suppose.
Yeah. And these things come and go. I remember I came up to Oxford in 1968 on the wave of student protests, and they just had the riots in Paris, les événements, and some thinkers in France were thinking, this at last is the moment when we will complete what was begun in the French Revolution, nearly 200 years earlier. The way that some French thinkers were conceiving of history, we are waiting for the real revolution. And there was a bit of a wave of that in Oxford. But what were we revolting about? Nobody quite knew in Oxford. There was a sort of mood that we ought to be revolting about something. So some people complained about college food. Others complained about having to wear gowns at lectures. Others complained because school teachers had written reports on potentially politically subversive students going up to Balliol College. Whatever it was, these were all ridiculous. But it was as though we had to protest about something because we were that generation. It was our turn. And there were all sorts of social, psychological things going on. And look back now, I mean, anecdotally, but it was funny. 10 years after that, 1978, there was a big reunion for the 10 years down the track from the Great Revolution of 1968. And there was a little thing at the bottom of the posters which said, babysitters provided. They can all become nice bourgeois wallpaper hanging people.
Cheese and wine will be provided at the revolution.
Exactly.
Yes. I mean, it's no coincidence, I'm sure, that you've released this book with Mike Bird in a very big political year. We're going to be having a general election here in the UK. There is, of course, a huge election in the US going to be happening at the end of the year, and many others actually around the world as well.
India particularly,
yes,
which is going on right now, and very scary stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And and in some cases, these are very volatile. We trust and hope that it won't come to sort of clashes in the UK. Who knows? But certainly it's not too hard to imagine that happening in the US. And obviously, one big part of this is the way in which Christianity, the church, has become so embroiled in politics in the USA. Trump himself frequently seeming to try and get on that bandwagon. I'm sure you saw his God Bless America Bible and things like that. But it happens on both sides. Joe Biden will say God bless America at the end of every speech he makes, I'm sure. What do you think about the way Christianity has been sort of used in that sense in American politics?
Yeah, I remember noticing this way back in the Reagan era, when Reagan was running for office in, I think it was 1980. And it was Reagan, I think, was the first American political campaigner who used the song God Bless America at the end of his campaign rallies. And I remember thinking at the time, watching that on television, this is very un-American, because officially in America, you've got that separation of church and state. And of course, where that went back to was to the 17th and 18th century, when in America they decided that they were not going to import the religious controversies from, say, the 30 Years' War or whatever in Europe, and they would have people belonging to whichever branch of Christianity they wanted, but it wasn't going to be instantiated in the Constitution, in the political reality. So for many Americans to this day, complete separation of church and state. The trouble is nature abhors a vacuum. And as I said, if you go back for most of human history and to most of human life right now, what we call religion and what we call politics simply are part of the same thing. Because if religion is about your ultimate values, about what you believe about, if there is a God, what's his will for the world, etc., that is bound to spill over into political questions. Likewise, if you think wicked things are being done in your society, what's your ultimate sanction against wickedness? Well, God is. So in the name of God, we're going to say you mustn't do that. The trouble is that because America held religion and politics officially apart, they haven't had a long tradition of figuring out how to put them back together again. And so it's now rushing back in like a vacuum. When somebody sticks a sharp object into it, there'll be an explosion. And that's the danger right now. And so, but then particularly the famous, right-wing white evangelicals in America. I'm not quite sure now what that word evangelical means anymore. It's more a sociocultural thing. I know what that word used to mean in English Christianity. It was a good word with very definitely theological overtones. Now it seems to be more about a societal thing, a particular way of going about things, and particularly, alas, in some quarters, not all, but in some quarters, it's become overtly racist, that it is a white movement. And I see that in part of the reaction to the so-called New Perspective on Paul, which is all about Paul declaring that because of Jesus and because of the gospel and the Spirit, all those who believe in Jesus, whatever their ethnic background, belong at the same table. And there's been a gut reaction against that by some of my fellow New Testament scholars in America, who just say, no, justification is all about our going to heaven and not about multiracial churches. And I want to say, sorry, this is a major glitch in post-Reformation Christianity. Christianity was the original multicultural movement. If we don't recognize that and seek to implement it in our churches, then watch out for trouble. And trouble is what we're now getting.
I suppose the big issue is that things that look and sound quite Christian can be dressed up, obviously, in very political clothes and so on.
And vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think I've seen, actual defences now, book-length defences of Christian nationalism, which seems a strange thing, but it exists. People who genuinely think that the solution to our troubles is to go back to some kind of theocracy, effectively. Now, obviously, those have existed in the past, sort of forms, and people may look back on some of that and say, well, things were better back then. We tend to look at history with rose-tinted spectacles, don't we? What for you is the problem, though, with that vision of how to conduct society, to kind of the imposition in that sense of Christianity?
Right. I mean, the ultimate problem is, as I say, as in Acts 17, where Paul says in Athens, that the Creator God made from one stock or of one blood, there's different texts at that point, all nations of humans to dwell on the face of the earth, and God's message is for all of them alike. And when Paul is talking about the church in Ephesians, part of the whole point of the church is that it's Jew and Gentile coming together as symbolizing the heaven and earth coming together thing. You see this in Ephesians 1, spilling over to Ephesians 2, resulting in Ephesians 3, that through the church, through this multicolored church, the manifold wisdom of God might be made known to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. In other words, this dream of a church, as in the book of Revelation, of all nations and tribes and tongues and so on, all praising God together. That's where the letter to the Romans goes in chapters 14 and 15, which so often fall off the back of people's expositions of Romans, as sometimes it's done with mine when I've been lecturing. Heaven help us. But that vision, which is the early Christian vision, that we belong together as a single family across the different cultural divides, and that's ethnic, but it's also male-female, it's also class, so slaves and free, and all sorts in between. If we had even glimpsed a bit of that over the last 500 years in the Reformation churches, everything would have been different. I trace part of the problem there, and this has to be thought through, to the fact that Christians quite rightly in the 16th century wanted to have the Bible in their own languages and the liturgy in their own languages. And so, but once you've done that, by the end of the 17th century in London, you have a Portuguese church and a Polish church and a French church and a Swedish church, as well as lots of English-speaking churches. And then they all export themselves to the New World, and they set up a German church here and a Dutch church there and whatever it is. And they develop their own theologies, and then they, of course, are right, and the ones down the road, they're a bit odd. And a lot of that oddness is an ethnic oddness. They just do stuff differently from how we do. And we bundle that up together. And so now we have an ecumenical movement where we're getting back to what we should never have abandoned in the first place. Now that's enormously important to say this is central. It's not peripheral. In the New Testament. It's not just a little bit of table manners on the side with the real gospel being somewhere else. This is the instantiation of the gospel.
Can we say it's safe to say you won't be endorsing the God Bless America Bible then?
I want God to bless America, and I want God to bless Canada and Mexico and Guatemala and everywhere else. Of course I do. But no, it's a difficult one for this reason. That I mentioned before, when I was in the Middle East during the First Intifada, there were terrible things going on within short walking distance of where I was living, people's homes being blown up and all the rest of it. And I was chatting with some Jewish friends one night, and one of them said, you need to remind yourself that in this part of the world, forgiveness has never been seen as a virtue. I thought, wow, just think about that for a minute. And she said, justice is what people believe in here, and justice means if somebody hits you, you must hit them back just as hard, if not harder. That's the only way to get justice. And if you don't do that, you are being immoral because it shows you don't believe in justice. And I remember thinking, I grew up in a country where we're not very good at forgiving each other, but forgiveness is a good word. We know it's something that we ought to be trying to do. And we work at it a little bit if we can. But the thought of living in a country where that just doesn't obtain. So from that point of view, and from the point of view of a country which encourages the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, the thought of those things being instantiated in the life of a culture, even if people aren't very good at them, is a whole lot better than a culture which is all about violence and anger and hatred and mistrust. And so, and my older son, who's a historian, came upon a newspaper cutting from the 1930s from the northeast of England, where my family came from, in which my grandfather, who had been a colonel in the First World War, was making a speech about how the British way of life was so much superior to many other nations, and he was instancing examples of things that we've learned from Christianity in British culture. I kind of shuddered at it. I thought, oh, grandfather, what were you doing with that? What was that about? But so I'm not saying that there isn't such a thing as the gospel impacting a whole subculture so that at least we know that something matters here. But the danger then is that we then think, okay, so we British or we American or whoever, we are automatically now all right, whatever we do. And the answer is no, the church needs to go on holding up the mirror to power.
Because also the other thing is that it's, even if those characteristics are absent, still if we say God bless, or we sing God save the King, or say God bless America, or we bring, it's, and I think that's was such a shame. So we had Rory Stewart on the podcast, and he was chatting to Jonathan Aitken, and it sort of, Jonathan was prodding him like, why don't you bring your faith? I know you have one. Why don't you bring it into your politics a bit more? I'd really appreciate it. And Rory sort of pointed to that, to the the US and sort of said, well, that's why, because it never goes well.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't. You know, there have been great Christian leaders. One of the tragedies of mid-20th century Britain was that William Temple died quite young, because he was a highly respected Christian leader who could articulate great visions of truth and practical truth and how this is going to work out. And when he died in 1944, I think it was, just before the end of the war, people, oh dear, we needed that voice. And we need more voices that can speak into the councils of state, not shrilly and not saying, because I'm a Christian, I'm just going to tell you how it is, but who've thought through the issues and can present a wise case. We need that so badly.
To bring this sort of to an end, which I'm very reluctant to do, but you towards the end of the book, you and Mike Beard, you make a case for confident pluralism. And I'd just be really fascinated. Can you just break open what you mean by that?
Yeah. People will need to read the book at that point, and I have to say this was one of the bits which Mike Beard drafted, which I was very happy with, but we took it in turns to draft different bits and so on. And I was a little surprised initially when he went there. Then I thought, no, actually, this is right, because we don't want a world where the church says we're going to regulate everything, and unless people will sign up and come to church, etc., then they're going to be second-class citizens. So it's ironically a Christian imperative, and because of the nature of the gospel, because we believe in the Sermon on the Mount, that the gospel will spread by people who are meek, people who are mourning for the loss of all that's gone wrong, people who are hungry for justice, people who are pure in heart. That's how the gospel works, not people who take a big stick and threaten people with punishment unless they square up and come to faith. And so that allows for the pluralism. And it's rather like the paradox of democracy, that democracy must tolerate the elements in a society which might seek to destroy it. Because if you don't tolerate them, you're not being democratic anymore. And in the same way, the Christian must affirm the right of other people to other opinions as part of saying that the gentle, wise rule of King Jesus works through the gentle, wise rule and the power of the Spirit. And that actually real change does happen that way, but it may not be as quick or as going in the direction that we would necessarily want. So hence the need for pluralism. Not because we want a laissez-faire position, but because the alternative, as the imposition of a Christian worldview on everybody, simply isn't the way of Jesus, the way of the Sermon on the Mount. But it's a confident pluralism, because if we believe that Jesus is Lord, and if we believe that the Church, by instantiating this message, is actually going to hold the powers to account, then we ought to have the courage of our convictions instead of running away to a distant heaven where we can be safe while the rest of the world goes to hell.
Which all circles all the way back to Jesus' words, my kingdom is not grown out of this world, it is for this world. That perfectly encompasses that.
It is fascinating. When I was very young and first doing graduate work, I remember trying to wrestle with some of these questions and realizing that I just didn't have the tools to do it. And it's really through the long pilgrimage of studying Jesus in his first century context, and what did the kingdom of God mean, and how is Jesus revising the first century views of the kingdom of God, that forced me through the 1980s and 90s really to start thinking much more about what that actually means on the street in Britain or around the world.
Yeah, and that it's not. I think what I love about the book that you and Mike have put together is that this weird like tension and complex and nuance, all of these words keep coming up. And I just think if there's one thing that people on both sides need to remind themselves, Christian and not, is that the chances are, we'll be working this through always, and it's nuanced and tense and all of these things.
And you see that in church history. And some of the great debates in church history have been between very subtle thinkers who want to nuance it different this way and that.
The book is wonderful, and I would recommend it to everyone. Jesus and the Powers, particularly this year, is incredibly timely and relevant and wise, very wise. Tom, you say that you glean the wisdom of others, but I think we're all going to be gleaning some from you this year. So thank you so much.
Yes, the same from me. Thank you so much, Tom, for being our guest on Re-Enchanting today. Jesus and the Powers, co-authored with Mike Bird, is available now. Do go and get it. It's going to be a really helpful guide to what is going to be quite a tumultuous, I'm sure, election year. And there's lots of wisdom here gleaned from others. So thank you so much, Tom, for putting this out there today.
That's very kind of you to say that, but I've enjoyed chatting to you. So all the very best, and let's hope that it has the desired effect.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you for listening. So if you want more Re-Enchanting, you know where to find us. And you can make future episodes like this happen at seenandunseen.com/give. But for now, we will see you next time.